I used to be an atheist, not a casual one either. I grew up in circumstances where skepticism felt like the only rational response to the world around me. With a family that couch surfed, a father couldn't hold a job for sometimes more than a couple of months, and a backdrop of abuse. Going into adulthood, God simply wasn't a concept that fit the circumstances of where I came from. I couldn't see God's hand in my life, so God just didn't make sense for a kid like me. But Richard Dawkins did, Sam Harris did, and Hitchens did. So I read them seriously, applied their standards, and began to build a worldview around the idea that religion was what happened when people stopped asking hard questions. And that paradigm held together for a long time. Well, this episode today is for the people who are now where I was. For the street atheist who really thinks that they're the one following the evidence. For the ex-Mormon who left the church and decided the rational upgrade was philosophical materialism. Or the position that matter and energy operating under natural laws being the complete and sufficient explanation for anything and everything that exists. And for the person who thinks that the burden of proof is entirely on the religious side of the table. What I want to do is to show you what happens when you actually apply the same evidentiary standard that you use on religious claims to the materialist framework itself. Not to scripture and not to the ancient world, but to the actual physics, the actual archaeology, and the actual philosophy of mind. What I found personally when I did that was I found that the framework doesn't really hold up under its own rules. For example, philosophical materialism is not the rational default that it presents itself as. But it is, when you apply the extraordinary evidence standard, honestly, actually the least defensible position on the table. So I'm going to show you that today using secular scholars, secular mathematics, and secular history. Really quickly before we move on, I want to thank everyone who watches and supports this channel. Your continuing support helps me make more content like this, and all of the engagement and the likes and the shares really help. If you want to help me grow the channel and improve these videos, please consider donating to my Ko-Fi or my PayPal linked in the channel description. I really appreciate everyone that has donated so far and everyone that simply watches my videos regularly. Again, thank you. And one last thing before we start. As usual, the scholars cited in this episode didn't set out to support anything that I believe. Several of these committed atheists like Penrose, Nagel, Hoyle, Flew, and Crick just followed their own fields to conclusions that ended up complicating their own positions, but said so anyway. Rather than being a sourcing strategy, that's just what the evidence produced when people without an agenda engaged with it seriously. But take a look for yourself. Because all of these sources are in the pinned comment below. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni Standard. So what exactly is the claim atheism is making, and why does it have a burden of proof? Let's be precise about what we're arguing against, because the word atheism gets misused in two very different ways. One version is agnosticism in disguise. That would be the genuinely humble position of someone who isn't convinced either way. That's a totally defensible position, and we're not really going to be touching on that. What I'm actually addressing today is something a bit more ambitious. Today, we're tackling philosophical materialism, which holds that physical matter and energy operating under natural laws is the complete and sufficient explanation for everything that exists, like the universe itself, the life in it, the consciousness observing it, and the religious traditions that have appeared in every human civilization, without exception, across all of recorded history. Now, that's kind of a lot to account for. The actual evidentiary standard that atheists most consistently apply to religious claims is the one that Carl Sagan articulated, saying extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That standard follows from a basic probabilistic reasoning, which is that the more a claim departs from what background knowledge would lead us to expect, the more evidence is now required. So, the real question is whether it's being applied consistently, because the claim that a finely tuned universe containing conscious beings who independently produced identical theological frameworks across every continent arose by accident with no guiding intelligence is about as extraordinary a claim as human thought has ever produced. It makes the claim God exists look pretty modest by comparison. Now, part of what makes this conversation frustrating is that the new atheist movement spent 2 decades conflating the deliverances of empirical science with the conclusions of philosophical materialism. acting like because science explains how things work, materialism is therefore true. But those aren't the same claim. Science studies the physical world, but materialism is the claim that the physical world is all there is. So that second claim needs its own evidence, which means that the confidence the new atheist movement borrows from science doesn't really belong there. They're just using science's credibility to prop up a philosophical position that science doesn't actually establish. Because I think it's important, let's name those two tactics. The first is known as definitional retreat, where they redefine atheism as merely the absence of belief to escape the burden of proof, while still arguing that consciousness is just neural complexity, that religion evolved from fear and ignorance, and that the universe arose through natural processes. Again, those are substantive positive claims. You don't get to use the minimal definition to escape the burden and then argue the full metaphysical position. That's not consistent. And the second move is known as Russell's teapot. In this specific context, it's the idea that theism bears the entire burden of proof because nobody's proved a teapot orbits the sun. Basically, it's shifting the burden of proof away from the person making the claim to begin with. But what these moves actually establish is a little narrower, meaning that you aren't required to believe a claim with no supporting evidence. Now, whether the theist position is in that category or not is exactly what this episode addresses. So, doesn't science explain where the universe came from, and what does physics actually say? The fine-tuning argument was one of the first things that started shifting the framework for me, and not just because someone made a persuasive case, but because I looked at the numbers directly. But don't take my word for it. Roger Penrose, the mathematician and physicist from Oxford, and not a religious man, actually calculated the probability of the universe arriving at its current low-entropy initial state by chance. The real figure that he came up with is 10 raised to the power of 10 raised to the power of 123. That number doesn't even fit inside human intuition or inside the observable universe. But the real issue isn't just that the initial state was improbable, because random events can absolutely be improbable. The issue is that it was improbable in the specific direction required to produce a universe capable of containing complexity, chemistry, and observers. A randomly improbable state could point anywhere, but a state calibrated to permit life points towards something. So, the inference from specified improbability to design isn't actually a religious move, it's the standard methodology of forensic science, archaeology, and SETI research. For example, when we find an arrowhead, we infer design, not because stones can't chip by accident, but because the chipping on the stone fell in precisely the pattern required to produce a functional tool. The exact same reasoning applies to a universe whose initial conditions fell in precisely the pattern required to produce stars, planets, chemistry, and observers. Now, the standard materialist response is a shifting of the goalpost that ends up in the multiverse, which is described as an infinite number of universes with varying constants, and we happen to inhabit the one compatible with life. This theory proposes an infinite number of unobservable, untestable entities specifically to avoid the conclusion that this universe was designed. By the standard that atheists apply to religious claims that it's unfalsifiable, unobservable, and requiring belief in entities beyond detection, the multiverse itself is a faith claim. Not faith in the religious sense of trust in a personal God, but definitely faith in the epistemic sense of holding a belief without any observational support. That exact structure applies symmetrically here, and the multiverse is just the clearest example of it. Fred Hoyle, an astronomer who was committed atheist, looked at the carbon resonance that makes life chemistry possible and wrote that the universe looks like a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. Now, he never became a theist, he just followed the math and said what it showed. But the calibration of the universe isn't the only place where that reasoning leads. There's a second main feature of the physical world that materialism has an even harder time with, one that doesn't involve telescopes or particle accelerators, but every moment of your personal experience of being alive. So, what about consciousness? Doesn't neuroscience explain the mind? While neuroscience explains which brain regions activate during which tasks and how chemistry affects cognition, what it hasn't explained, and what the most serious secular philosophers of mind acknowledge it hasn't explained, is why any of that physical activity produces subjective experience at all. David Chalmers, a philosopher at NYU and not religious, named this the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems are things like explaining how the brain integrates information, but the hard problem asks why the mind perceives itself to be, or on a smaller scale, why pain doesn't just trigger avoidance behavior, but it actually hurts. Just imagine a being physically identical to you in every measurable way, but with no inner experience, no soul, so to speak. They respond to pain in the same way that you do, but nothing is happening on the inside. Philosophers call this being a philosophical zombie, and the question that materialism can't answer is why we aren't those. If behavior is the thing that has survival value, then experience is surplus to requirements on a materialist account. Now, the standard reply is that experience is an epiphenomenon, or a byproduct that exists alongside behavior without causing it. But evolution doesn't preserve causally inert structures over millions of years. So if experience does nothing, then there's no selection pressure for it to exist. And if experience does have a causal power, then materialism needs to explain how subjective states acquire physical causal force. Either way you cut it, the materialist is back at the hard problem. Now, Thomas Nagel, a philosopher from NYU and an atheist, wrote an entire book arguing that materialism cannot account for consciousness and that the field has not ever solved this problem. As can be expected, the response from secular academic circles was light on the refutation and heavy on irritation. But the direction that the field has been moving towards panpsychism and towards consciousness as fundamental rather than emergent is itself a concession that the simplest version of materialism that street atheism relies on is already gone. When secular philosophers of mind find themselves arguing that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality rather than a product of matter, they've actually conceded the very ground that the theist argument stands on, specifically that the physical is not the complete explanation for everything. Because here's something that isn't explained by the physical. Explaining how the eyes work doesn't prove that there's nothing to see. So, what does the actual historical and archaeological record show about the origins of religion? Well, the materialist account of religious origins goes like this. Early humans, frightened by phenomenon that they couldn't explain, invented gods to manage their anxiety, and these primitive superstitions gradually evolved into organized religion. This account comes from Victorian anthropologists Edward Tyler and James Fraser, writing before any modern archaeology or cognitive science existed, and it runs headfirst against the evidence. The most significant problem to me is a site known as Göbekli Tepe. This is an archaeological site in southeastern Turkey excavated beginning in 1994 by Klaus Schmidt. What Schmidt found was a complex of massive carved stone pillars, some weighing 20 tons, built approximately 11,600 years ago. That date predates writing by 6,000 years. It predates agriculture, and it predates every settled civilization in the record. But what it does not predate is religion. By the assessment of its excavator and the majority of scholars who have studied it, Göbekli Tepe is a ritual site. It's a temple complex. The people who built it hadn't figured out farming yet, that we know of, but they had an organized, large-scale cooperative labor around something that wasn't materialistically practical. So, if religion is a coping mechanism for what primitive minds couldn't understand, it should appear after agriculture and cities. But instead it appears first. So, the most ancient deliberate human construction that we have is not a granary, it's a full-blown temple. The materialist story has primitive people inventing God because they were scared of thunder, but the archaeological record has them building religious sites before they figured out bread. That's the real chronological problem, and Jacques Calvin takes it further with a causal argument. In The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture, he argued that the symbolic and religious revolution didn't just precede the agricultural one, it actually drove it. The shift towards sacred symbolism structured the kind of cooperative, purposeful cognition that made organized civilization possible in the first place. On Calvin's account, religion isn't filling a gap left by ignorance. It's the actual cognitive foundation that made knowledge-seeking civilization possible at all. So we see that the chronological evidence establishes that religion came first. The causal argument just suggests it came first for a reason. And then the cognitive science of religion arrives at a similar conclusion from a different angle. Pascal Boyer at Washington University documented that the human cognitive system generates religious concepts at a normal output, not as a pathological one. and Stuart Guthrie argued that religious cognition is hyperactive agent detection, meaning that it's a system tuned to see agents because the cost of missing a predator is higher than a false positive. That's a naturalistic account, and what it establishes is that religion is what the mind produces when it runs normally. But what it doesn't establish is whether the system is tracking something real or not. A cognitive architecture that evolved to detect agents accurately would probably produce genuine religious perception when there is an actual agent to detect, and false positives when there isn't. Whichever one religious perception actually is depends on whether the agent are there, and again, that's precisely the question that the materialist account assumes is settled when it isn't. So, the archaeology shows that religion came first, and the cognitive science shows that religion is normal and not pathological. What appears that the mind is reliably generating across every ancient culture and period leads directly to the next question. What is converging across ancient traditions, and what does that force the materialist to explain? Now, I've covered the ancient convergence in detail on this channel before, so I'll keep it tight and just use it as evidence in a different argument rather than retell the whole story. The question I'm putting to the materialist account here is simple. What's your explanation for this? Because the options are pretty limited. But before laying out what converges, I'm going to address a predictable objection. That cross-cultural comparison is just cherry-picking, and that you can find surface similarities between anything if you look hard enough. But the answer is that the scholars doing this work, like Mircea Eliade at the University of Chicago, Walter Burkert at the University of Zurich, Michael Heiser at the University of Wisconsin, and Jan Osman at the University of Konstanz, are not LDS apologists. They are all comparative religion scholars and archaeologists working within their own fields, and the convergence that they document is at the structural level, not the surface level like the critique requires. So, when you map religious traditions across every inhabited continent before any of them had documented contact with each other, the same structural elements appear independently. By structural, I mean the specific organizational form matches, and not just a general concept, but a particular arrangement of who, what, and how. Like a divine council, which is a heavenly assembly presiding under a chief deity. This appears in the Ugaritic text, the Mesopotamian epics, the original Hebrew text before it was edited, the Vedic tradition, the Greek Olympian structure, and the Aztec pantheon, to name a few. Michael Heiser documented that the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed Deuteronomy 32 originally read Sons of God, where later edited versions replaced it with Children of Israel, which is an intentional directional theological edit removing the divine council implication, and a cosmic flood with a specific sequential structure, like the divine decision to enact the flood, the chosen survivor, the vessel, the storm, the mountain landing, the bird release, and the covenant, which appears in Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Mayan, and Australian traditions with no documented contact. And a sacred ascent ritual with structured passage through levels of heaven involving secret knowledge and sacred names, and appearing in Egyptian mystery traditions, Greek mysteries, Jewish Merkaba mysticism, and Hermetic traditions independently. So again, this convergence is structural, not thematic. It's not that different cultures happened to find God meaningful and had some coincidental themes. It's that they actually arrived at the same specific organizational picture of what God and the sacred look like, in detail, seemingly without talking to each other. And this whole convergence was the second thing that moved me personally. Once the fine-tuning argument made the materialist position feel unstable, I started looking at what the scholarship was actually showing about structural patterns appearing across cultures with no contact. The narrative I'd been working from wasn't matching what I was finding. When a framework stops matching the evidence, just know that the honest move is to follow where the evidence is actually going. Now, the materialist has two options. The first, as cultural diffusion fails geographically almost immediately. The Americas had no contact with the Old World during the relevant periods, so the working theory would have to be that ancient Mesoamericans independently invented the same divine council, the same cosmic flood sequence, and the same sacred ascent ritual as ancient Mesopotamia, without talking to anyone. The second option is that of shared psychology, saying that humans share a brain and therefore generate the same archetypes. It's definitely the more sophisticated response, but shared cognitive architecture produces a simple family resemblance. What the ancient record shows is a sequential and organizational identity across traditions that were separated by oceans and millennia. Shared psychology might explain why humans are drawn toward sacred ideas, but it doesn't explain why those ideas take the same specific structural form in cultures that had no contact. That kind of convergence requires a different kind of explanation. So, what about DNA and the origin of life? Doesn't biology account for this? Evolution by natural selection is one of the most well-evidenced frameworks in biology, and this episode's theism actually has no conflict with it. The question of whether life evolved is inherently different from the question of whether the process that produced life in the first place is explained by unguided physical processes. To put it simply, evolution starts with living, self-replicating organisms. But how the first one arose from chemistry is a separate and genuinely open problem. Now, the specific difficulty is that the simplest self-replicating molecule carries information that isn't just complex, but it's specified. It performs a function. Natural selection explains how functional complexity increases once you have self-replicating organisms because it operates by selection for function. But at the origin of life, there are no organisms yet. There's nothing to select or be selected. The functional information in the first replicating molecule had to arise from chemistry alone, without a selection mechanism, which is exactly the problem. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA and a committed materialist, found the probability so low that he proposed directed panspermia, saying that life itself was seeded from somewhere else in the universe. But that still doesn't actually solve the problem. It just relocates it. So the man who discovered DNA actually thought that the materialist account of its origin was so improbable that ancient aliens looked like a reasonable alternative to him. Antony Flew worked through the philosophical implications of this much more carefully than anyone. Flew was the intellectual backbone of philosophical atheism for 50 years, and in 2004 he actually changed his position to deism specifically because of the specified complexity argument. The claim that the signature of intelligent causation is not just complexity, but complexity organized toward a function. He gave an independent interview with philosopher Gary Habermas, where he affirmed the position changed 3 years before his book was published. So the manipulation objection here doesn't really land. But the really notable thing about Flew isn't where he landed, because deism is still a long way from any specific religious tradition. It's that after 50 years of building the case for atheism, he followed the evidence past where his prior commitments had wanted him to go. So, what does all of this actually mean? Well, when you apply the extraordinary evidence standard consistently to the universe, to consciousness, to the origin of life, and to the ancient human record, the materialist account fails it across every field simultaneously. The multiverse is a faith claim. Abiogenesis resolving itself is also a faith claim. Consciousness turning out to be reducible to neural complexity is, you guessed it, a faith claim. None of those have current evidentiary support. They have hope. And once I recognize that, both positions require faith, like there is no neutral ground where you can stand without making commitments about the nature of reality, then the question shifted from faith or reason to which account does the available evidence actually support? And that question has an answer. This episode today isn't claiming to have proved God's existence beyond doubt, because that's not what the evidence permits, and it's just not what's being argued. But across physics, biology, history, archaeology, and philosophy of mind, the evidence is more consistent with the designing intelligence behind the cosmos than with the materialist account of a universe that organized itself from nothing into conscious beings who independently arrived at the same theological picture across every culture on Earth. That's actually the more coherent position given what we actually have, and it requires, at minimum, moving off the confident materialist default and acknowledging that the question is still open. David Berlinski, a secular Jew, meaning not religious at all, and a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, argued in The Devil's Delusion that the new atheist movement's confidence vastly exceeds its evidential warrant. His target wasn't even religion. It was the specific claim that science has answered questions philosophy, history, and the human religious tradition have been working on for millennia. Some people might try to use his Discovery Institute affiliation to dismiss the argument without engaging it, but Berlinski himself is explicit that he is not arguing for intelligent design or any religious position. The affiliation doesn't actually change whether the argument is right, and the argument's conclusion isn't abstract. It has a cost for atheists. Just know that acknowledging that the evidence doesn't support the confident materialist position is not the same as becoming religious, but it is the honest move. And honest moves cost something when they require you to publicly revise a position that you've held and defended. Now, I know what that cost looks like because I've paid it on both ends. The people I grew up with and spent time with as an adult saw it as a betrayal. By believing in God, I seemed to be going soft, and the religious communities I moved toward weren't exactly welcoming either. I was a guy with no family name or connections and appearing as just a high school dropout with a background that made people pretty uncomfortable. All of this to say that what I found on the other side of honest inquiry was a harder question, not an easier one. But in the end, I found a framework that could actually hold these questions. To bring it all together today, the argument wasn't theological, it was evidentiary. We simply took the tools that atheism uses to evaluate religious claims and applied them to the materialist framework itself, to the actual physics, the actual archaeology, and the actual philosophy of mind. What we found is that the materialist account requires more special pleading, more unfalsifiable auxiliary hypotheses, and more promissory faith than the position that it claims to have replaced. The fine-tuning isn't a gap, it's a measurement. The hard problem of consciousness isn't a gap. It's a structural problem that the field's best secular thinkers acknowledge they can't solve within materialism. The ancient convergence isn't pattern matching. It's independent witness at a level of structural specificity that shared psychology simply doesn't predict. And Göbekli Tepe isn't a gap. It's a temple that was built before agriculture by people who apparently decided the first thing worth organizing civilization-scale labor around was the sacred. In the end, the materialist story is not where the evidence points. It's where the story started, before the evidence came in. It's what happens when people stop asking the hard questions. To the LDS viewers watching this, you already live inside a framework that takes the ancient convergence seriously, has no structural conflict with science, and has a coherent account of consciousness, agency, and the origin of the cosmos. What this episode gives you is the argument from outside, made entirely from secular scholars who would probably rather not support it. So when someone tells you that science has disproved God, ask them which version of science. Ask what Penrose said about the initial state of the universe. Ask how Nagel accounts for consciousness. Ask why Göbekli Tepe exists. And then ask why Crick proposed ancient aliens. Once again, the evidence is on your side, and none of these people were even trying to give it to you. To the skeptics and ex-Mormon atheists watching this, I was where you are. I read Dawkins and I applied the same standards and paid for leaving them behind in communities I couldn't go back to, and communities that didn't want me in the first place. I'm not asking you to become religious today, but I'm asking you to apply your own standard consistently to things like the multiverse, to promissory materialism, to the convergence data, and to the hard problem. The claim that all this happened by accident with no guiding intelligence is in fact the most extraordinary faith claim in the room. It simply doesn't have the evidence. Now, again, I understand that moving off that position could cost something. I know because I've paid for it myself. But I encourage you to do it anyway. I promise that the honest question is worth far more than any comfortable answer. To the curious outsiders watching this, what you've seen today isn't a religious argument, it's just a philosophical and historical one. The claim that a designing intelligence is behind the universe, behind life, behind consciousness, and behind the consistent theological witness of the entire human record is not a claim that asks you to abandon reason. It is, on the available evidence, the more coherent position. Where that intelligence is and what it wants and whether it has communicated with humanity, well, those are all separate questions for another day. I encourage you to go check out all the sources in the pinned comment and see for yourself. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni Standard.